Fright Fest, let's fucking say.
Honour today to bring to the Fright Fest stage Larry Fessenden. To go back to the very start of a career, I know that really you first started out as an actor in high school, you were acting, but you always had a love of Super 8 movies and you were cutting your teeth, kind of doing it all yourself, editing them yourself. I mean, what was it originally that grabbed your attention and made you know you wanted to be a horror filmmaker?
Well, I always loved horror. That was just a given. I grew up in the 70s in New York City, where you would watch black and white Boris Karloff movies on television, and the 4:30 movie was Godzilla and this sort of thing, and that was my taste. A little bit later on, I saw Night of the Living Dead on TV, and it made an immense impression because it was so much more visceral than the movies I had loved as a kid. And then in the 70s, I liked real, you know, mainstream cinema, which in those days was actually some of the great films ever made, like The Godfather and Martin Scorsese and so on. And I thought I wanted to be an actor. I loved De Niro and Jack Nicholson and James Cagney earlier. But what I learned was, I remember watching One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and I saw that on one version, or one shot, Nicholson's hand was in one position, and on the reverse it was in another position, and that's when I realized how movies were made, that you actually shot the whole scene from one side and then the other. So I suddenly saw how magical films were. This was before DVDs or even Premiere Magazine or Total Film, and everything was shrouded in mystery when I was a kid. We didn't even have a VHS when I was young. So I suddenly realized how important the camera was to telling the story, and I picked up a Super 8 and I started to tell stories in the late 70s with the visual medium.
Also, very important in your films is sound, and one of the interesting stories about you when you were starting out when you were a kid is you used to take movies, didn't you, on cassettes, audio cassettes, and just listen to them back. And I think that's reflected in the fact that all of your films, the sound design is absolutely key.
I appreciate you remembering that. I often told that story in talking about my appreciation of sound, is that I would listen to movies on a cassette tape. I'd get up late at night and record a movie off of the TV, and I'd listen to it, and it was, so I'd know the rhythm of the footsteps that led up to the car door closing, and even the most mundane sequence in a movie, when you're only listening to audio, makes you realize that there's certain rhythms that become part of the storytelling, and needless to say, music and so on is so important. But it was really also just the incidental sounds. And as I started to make horror films, I wanted to start evoking the surrealist and subjective world that we all live in. And so you start to tweak those sounds, and it starts to really bring you into the subjective nature of our existence. And so I really love tweaking with natural sounds.
You've said that you've always had an acute awareness of horror in the modern world, which I think again is reflected in your films, that they're very naturalistic, there's a reality to them, a kind of free-form quality, and then the genre elements are grafted in on top of that. I mean, what exactly did you mean by horror in the modern world?
Well, I really always say I think it's the way I'm wired. Just even as a kid, I had a comfortable existence. There was no real threats, and maybe in a way that makes you, if you're a sensitive kid, you start to imagine threats and sort of see, the way I imagine it is that I see the potential for disaster in every little moment. I would walk by a fence and imagine myself impaled. I mean, that's something that just happens with your synapses. And so I always say I approach horror, I want to invite other people to see the world the way I do, which is a threatening and hideous place. Unfortunately, the nature of the world is that it proves to be correct, and there's just more and more encroaching horror as we have overpopulation and some of the major troubles that the planet's going through. sort of confirm this sense. And a lot of the themes of my movies is this notion you can't go home, which is to say you can't go back to your youth, you can't go back to innocence, and you can't, in a sense, escape the encroachment of humanity on the world. There's nowhere now, you know, and if you think of Gone with the Wind, the last line is, well, tomorrow's another day. But if, in fact, we've made such a mess of things that tomorrow is not assured, this, to me, is true claustrophobia and true horror. And, of course, naturally, every one of us is looking forward to how we're going to die. There's a great Tom Waits song that says, you know, how's it going to end? And, you know, that's a preoccupation with some. People are concerned with getting laid and the cocaine and all the good fun, but I just think about the darker things.
You must be a lot of fun to live with.
I am a real delight. My kid thinks, I tell my kid it's the end of the world every day, and I think it's going to give him a tremendous resilience, because he rolls his eyes and say that's ridiculous. So I think I've given him this great opportunity to see life differently from myself, which I think is a gift.
You talked about the themes in your films, and we'll come on to them in a minute, but one of the interesting things is, despite the fact that they're very much set in a modern world and the horrors are very modern, like you said, it's kind of dysfunction, alienation, all these kind of things, but you also always hark back to traditional classic horror stories, like No Telling is very much a modern day Frankenstein story, Dracula is very apparent in Habit, Wendigo is kind of your riff on the Indian burial ground and curse, and it could almost be called your Wolfman picture as well. So is that something you always want to do, that you want to take these archetypes but put them into a recognisable world?
Well, another one of my preoccupations is that humanity in general is always searching for meaning, and let's be honest, it's a fairly arbitrary world, and so I think we have this natural desire to make sense of the world, religion being the most prominent response, but even atheists have some sense of order and are endless trying to see a moral universe. I find all of that sweet and desperate and sad, and so I think a lot of my movies are taking the archetypes that I grew up on loving, like the Frankenstein story, which is of course science challenging God, and then putting it in a modern context, and you realize that these same themes play out over and over, and that we're all sort of struggling to find mythologies in our mundane lives, you know, even if it's just so that you feel your life has some worth. And so I think there's always that tension in my films between the archetypical setup, and then I like to play it out in all of its mundanity.
You sent me an email last week where you said when you put together this showreel, it made you realise just how old-fashioned, just how sappy your films are, which of course you were saying that hopefully tongue-in-cheek. But there is an element of truth in terms of so many modern films. They're fast, there's like a kill scene every 5 seconds, they can be a little bit glib. We're often invited to laugh at the worst things often. But in your movies, there always seems to be poignancy. It's about something. There's very few death scenes in your films, but when they happen, they always come with a real melancholy kind of tenderness and bereavement to it. I mean, what do you make of all the kind of modern trend of guys who just put out these sharp, snappy horror films? Do you really think yours are outmoded?
Well, in a way I do, because you make films, you want to delight an audience, and you know, guys and gals in this audience are here for the thrills, you know, and I understand that's a role that horror plays, but I think with the advent of better technology, you know, you're able to show more and more detailed gore, and I just think that life, or our culture, just seems to be a process of heightening and heightening and heightening, and more ability to show more and more into shock, you know, as people become deadened to the sweet fruits of subtlety. So I mean, as I sort of said, I think ultimately I'm coming to horror through this strange back door of melancholy, you know, realizing that we have a brief time on this earth, how we treat our fellow people is sort of the concern, and, you know, in your relationships, and then of course, I still like the horror trope, so in some way I do prefer the genre. I mean, I'll sit down, try to write some other type of thing, and I used to film weddings, and my friend said, you've made my wedding look like a horror film, because I film everything from behind, and there's always a sense of mystery and the potential for people are stalkers. I mean, even the kiss, there's something about the kiss that's not quite right, and it'll all end badly, and it's just my nature. I mean, it's truly a matter of what colors I paint with. So, so it's only my awareness that, I'm a horror guy that makes me compare myself to the stuff that's out there, and then you go, well, this is not going to satisfy a certain appetite for shock. And I do want to say that, when you're young, you are interested, or in any case, I loved Henry Serial Killer. I love a great film called Angst, which I can never remember the director, but it's so there are some absolutely visceral, Man Bites Dog, which is satire, I absolutely love. But they all have something for me that is authentic and genuine. It's not, and the thing, if you want to talk about Saw, which by the way was actually a very good first film, but the subsequent movies, those are basically being made by corporations. And there's something deeply perverse and depraved about corporations making such viscerally grotesque product just to make money. I mean, what I love about horror is it is anti-authoritarian. It came from a place of rebellion, either to shock, the bourgeois, or to rage against the ongoing wars. But in particular in the '60s, when horror did, I Spit on Your Grave and whatever the hell, Last House on the Left, and of course my beloved Night of the Living Dead. All those movies seemed to be about something. They were confronting the complacent culture. So. That's still what interests me in movies, and the ones that do that, I enjoy. But the ones that are just rolling out the body count, I don't see the difference between that and a bad pop song.
Is there an element of rebellion in your own work? Because everything you just talked about, I mean, you yourself came from quite a privileged background, and you've always admitted that your dad was a banker, you went to the same school as George W. Bush, I believe, and you were never comfortable with that kind of background. You always felt inwardly like an outsider. So do you think that's why you found your home in horror?
Well, yes, so that's the case. And by the way, I always tried to make that clear, because I hate the indie story that is put out there, that, the rags to riches. I mean, a lot of filmmakers have some sort of advantage, and I just wanted to, despite the humiliation of saying I came from a privilege, I felt a need to make that clear, because I don't want somebody who can't get their first movie made struggling. But yes, it's a rebellion against the smugness of the upper class, or even the middle class, and just smugness in general, even if it's in a blue-collar context. Basically the arrogance of humanity I find despicable. And of course my movies often have something to do with nature or avenging spirits, and it's because I feel that we've lost a sense of awe for the world, and that is a true downfall, and will in fact lead to our undoing, which, I mean, unfortunately I'm correct. And I also feel, but so I felt like an outsider. I didn't understand people in my school and so on. And, in a weird way, I also feel, just as a weird kid, that's the other thing about the old horror movies, is that the Wolfman was an outsider. He was struggling with a curse that he couldn't understand. The real Frankenstein monster is, of course, this sweet innocent who's, he's, what's going on here? So, Creature from the Black Lagoon, I love these guys. All the classic monsters were outsiders. And one thing that's happened to horror is it's switched over to serial killers. And to me, this doesn't have the mythical depth and, in a way, the pathos that drew me to the medium. I mean, take it or leave it, but that's why Friday the 13th, or whatever, the children of Friday the 13th don't have the same appeal to me. And if you're on an airplane and you say I make horror films, the person's like, can I possibly get another chair? So I say I make scary movies because, and as I've admitted, they're not even that scary, but I make movies that are fantasy, or whatever. They're concerned with other matters than what is now considered a horror film, which usually evokes gore.